how do you trust open source software? Standard disclaimer, it's for educational purposes only. Please read through this. I'm Naveen Srinivasan. I'm excited to be speaking at RSA this year. I'm all about open source and supply chain security. I contribute to open source almost every day. I maintain few open source projects, and I contribute to a few of them. Brian.
Great, welcome everyone. My name's Brian Russell. I'm a product manager on Google's open source security team. I work on a few different projects, but one of them you'll be hearing more about today, OpenSSF Scorecards, in this general topic about how do you trust your open source software. So to kick us off, let's think about a fundamental question of just what really is trust. If we go with a pure dictionary definition, I'll just read it out loud. It's the firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. So that's a pretty broad concept that you can apply to a lot of different places, but we'll be looking at trust in the context of open source software, which is, how do you hold that firm belief in the software that you're using? How do you know that it is these things, that it's reliable, and that you can really depend on it? So with that definition of trust, let's think about how we actually build trust. There's kind of two rough ways to think about how you can build trust. There's what I would call kind of the ideal way that you would do gradually over time. This is where you can observe things very directly. You can really get to know an individual or an organization. If you think about in open source, if you could just work with every single project that you use, that would be a very ideal way to know if you can trust something. You would get a really good sense of, hey, I can understand that this project cares a lot about security, or I really like how they do these development practices. There's only one really big issue with taking that approach, and that's that it just doesn't scale very well. When you think about trying to go out and do that, you're not just looking at maybe one or two open source projects. You're looking at all of the open source projects that in turn depend, or rather are dependent upon by that end project. So you quickly get to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of different open source projects. So if we think about how we could solve this problem a little bit differently, we could do the second method, which is what I referred to as kind of jump-starting your ability to build trust. And that's where you can get to know an individual and organization by really looking at evidence of how they operate. So rather than taking time and really getting to know how this project is being managed, instead, look for evidence that they are employing good best practices, such that you can say, I think I get the gist of what they're doing. The benefit of that is that we can scale it up by just asking for the same evidence over and over again. And when you can do anything over and over again, it creates that potential to automate it. So we'll be talking really today about that second method of how you can just start to jumpstart trust. So thinking more about in the context of open source software, you have to start thinking about what evidence or what best practices really matter such that you could trust it more. So if you think about having two different projects, if you knew that Project A conducted code reviews and Project B did not, already you kind of know that one project simply has more people looking at it. It has a better chance of having mistakes caught. Same thing with if you have Project A that has a bunch of unpatched vulnerabilities and Project B does not. You get a sense of, this project is going to care if something happens, and you have a sense that you can trust them to do the right thing whenever a vulnerability is found. And so we can kind of keep going down this list of what best practices matter. And that comes just to these last three too, ensuring that permissions are set in an appropriate way, that you're reading in the right places and not allowing write access, that those projects that are relying on other projects are actually looking at what dependencies are coming in. They're making sure that they are the right dependencies. And you can get a sense of, is anyone actually looking at this project? Has anyone in the last 90 days gone and really interacted with an issue that's come up or made some code changes? So when we think about these types of best practices, those are the things that we're going to be looking at today. What best practices matter and how we can really start to collect those at scale. So throughout this talk, we just kind of want to keep thinking about what we've covered so far. We're establishing that trust matters. We're establishing that it's important to think about within that trust which best practices matter. And where we're going to be going here is really learning about different tools, where we're going to focus specifically on one tool to help you gather evidence of those best practices. So shifting from trust to actually being able to see evidence of all of this open source software, we have kind of a fundamental problem, and credit to XKCD for putting kind of this example together. If you look at this really blocky diagram, what you start to see is that this is a pretty good representation of what happens when you look behind the surface level of any modern infrastructure. What you see is a whole bunch of different pieces. You've got big pieces, you've got small pieces. Some of them, presumably are very well maintained. People are looking at making sure that those projects are secure and they're reliable. But you also have projects that, might have more of a single point of failure, and they could be very important pieces. So if you just look at this as a series of blocks, this doesn't really tell us very much other than, you've got big chunks of your code and small chunks of your code that are open source. But what we'd really like to do is actually apply a little bit more insight on top of that. If we could start to think about, here are projects that are doing a lot of good things. Here are projects that really could use some improvement. Here are some projects that are somewhere in the middle. Already, by just having a way to gain some insight into what's going on in your infrastructure, you have a sense of where to prioritize efforts. You have a sense of really where you're most at risk and where you can feel pretty good about what you're running. So if we think about how do we want to gather this insight, there's kind of two main ingredients that we're going to be using today. There are ways to pull in evidence programmatically in the form of making API calls. What we talked about, how you can use the GitHub API, or at least how the tool that we're using is using the GitHub API to really pull in different evidence. And our other ingredient is to apply some sort of a system to make sense of all that evidence, of what's important versus what's maybe a little bit less important. And that's really the key ingredients that start to give us the OpenSSF Scorecard. So this is an open source project in and of itself. I'll talk later in the presentation about the organization that's really helped build this up. But if you just look at this scorecard, you can see that at a glance, you've got a top-level score that gives you more of an immediate sense of how well a project is doing. And then within that, you have different criteria for what some of these best practices are that Scorecard is looking at. I'll go into detail on three of them in just a minute, but anytime that you see a scorecard, you can start to take a look at what each of these mean. On the project page, we go into a lot more detail about both what they mean, how important they are, and then how the scoring works. And we'll get to a couple of examples of how to calculate those scores in just a second. So if you'd like to follow along, if you want to just pull up a scorecard, there's always kind of the question of, okay, I understand the concept, but where can I actually find one? You can use deps.dev, which I'll say as a disclaimer is a Google project. It's not currently open source, but they are one of the biggest consumers of the OpenSSF Scorecard's data. And at the moment, they're a really convenient way to look at a scorecard. So if you're following along with this, this will take you to another OpenSSF project page called SigStore, which is an equally important project that I won't get into in this talk. But what you can see for SigStore is that there's a scorecard associated with it, and you can start to see exactly which practices they're doing well and maybe where there's a little bit of room for improvement. What I wanted to also point out is that from deps.dev, you can take a look at any of the dependencies that you might be using. They've got about between 1 and 2 million scorecards that they're pulling in that allow you to see just at a project by project level, here's how some of the security is going. So let's look a little bit at what a check consists of, and I always like to do things by example, so I just picked 3 that we could walk through for a moment. In code review, it is what it says. It's really, does this project require that code reviews take place before changes are merged, or does it not? We consider this very important, so the risk level associated with it is high. For each check that you'll see on this scorecard, you'll see basically the top level title, there's a description behind it, a risk level behind it, and then a scoring mechanism associated with it. The scoring kind of varies check by check, just because each check is looking for evidence in a slightly different way. But I'll use these same 3 in just a moment to get into how those are scored. So the second check to look at is maintained. Is a project actually having changes being made to it, or has it just been sitting there kind of dormant for a while? In general, projects that are not being observed become a lot more susceptible to unpatched vulnerabilities, or maybe taking changes if there's not really a strong governance model. So maintenance is an important part of it, and this check is really just looking simply over a 90-day window. Are you making changes on a regular basis? Are there issues being addressed on a regular basis? Then the third check that we'll look at as an example is binary artifacts. Are there binaries checked into this repo, or are there not? And in the case of binary artifacts, the reason it's a check for us is that code that is compiled into a binary becomes obfuscated. And you can't actually see exactly what's in it, even if you think you know what that binary is attached to. So we're looking specifically to make sure that only source code is actually checked into those repos. So with these 3 checks in mind, we'll look at exactly how would we score these 3. In general, we have kind of a principle of Olympic-style scoring. So start with a 10 and make deductions from there. For the most part, every individual check is weighted a little bit differently, scored a little bit differently. And for some checks, we're actually making deductions based on the lack of evidence rather than evidence of something that's not working. And then there is a possible state of having a -1. If you ever see a scorecard with a -1, that means something went wrong. We're just following kind of the standard practice of trying -1 for error. So back to our examples, if we look at code review, start with a 10. If we are reviewing every change that is being made to a project, it'll stay a 10. If, however, you're basically looking at all the changes that are made by people that are contributing to your project, but you're not looking at any of the automated changes, say that you're running Dependabot and recommendations are being made, and those are just getting merged without any review, that will dock you 3 points on the scorecard because you're still reviewing the bulk of changes. But in the converse of that, you might be in a state where you actually are reviewing the automated changes, but you have extreme faith in your contributors, and so those aren't being reviewed. But in this case, we would dock you 7 for that. And if you're simply not doing any reviews, that is how you would get a score of 0 for this check. So for our next example, binary artifacts, I don't have to really get into too many details here. Start with a 10 for each binary artifact that you have. Just keep decreasing the score by 1 until you get down to 0. And then maintained I picked in part because the scoring gets a little more nuanced. We're basically looking at a combination of time and activity where, again, we look over a 90-day window, which is roughly 13 weeks. And if you are making at least one commit or you're addressing one issue per week in that period, which 90 days translates to about 13 weeks, that will keep you at a score of 10. If you have inactivity over those periods of time, that's how that score will go down. And effectively, there's a pretty straightforward algorithm that will weight that combination of time and activity. But you can see here how it progresses from 10 down to 0. So for each of these checks, what you can do is take a look on the project page. It will always give you details about what it is, and then in addition to seeing how it's scored, it's open source itself, you can always dig in and see how it's calculated. So to reiterate, trust is key for us in open source software. We want to identify best practices that are jump-starting our ability to trust something. And we're looking at ways to programmatically gather that evidence. And so we're looking at OpenSSF Scorecards as one of those ways to bring in that evidence. Because ultimately, we just want to make sure that when we're looking at any dependencies that we've brought in, we've got situational awareness. And we also, we've been talking a lot about the consumers, but on the maintainer side, we also want to give you a sense of how your project itself is doing, so being able to give more of an internal assessment on a project. So those are the basic mechanics of collecting evidence through OpenSSF Scorecard. Let's talk about just the state of supply chain security that we're operating in today. Because if everything was safe, we wouldn't really need to be using something like scorecards to try to assure ourselves that it is. Just the reality that we're living in, open source software is growing at a very strong growth rate. A couple of things here. Linux Foundation has found that free and open source software really is constituting about 70 to 90% of any modern software solution. And in Sonatype's annual State of the Software Supply Chain, you can see that open source growth is just continuing. It's up across the board in all ecosystems that they're tracking. So with that growth in open source, unfortunately, we also have a lot of growth in supply chain attacks themselves. This is why it's more important than ever to really be looking at where your open source software is coming from, but on top of that, how it's actually being managed and really, is it in a safe state? I recommend to anyone who is starting to look at software supply chain issues and security issues with it, this is it's a really helpful report. Within it too, they looked at different tools to see what are good indicators that a project over time is going to become vulnerable. They found that scorecards had very positive correlation with higher scorecard scores means less likelihood of issues over time. When it comes to how those checks break it down, in the report they give a lot more details, but you can basically see that some checks more than others are predictors of whether or not a project is going to become vulnerable. But on the whole, scorecards continues to be a good tool, and you can basically decide from within it which pieces of evidence are most important to you. So just in terms of where Scorecards is at kind of within in this overall picture. Scorecards is a growing project. We've been getting some different mentions and additional adoption. Eclipse Foundation has been using Scorecards on their own repositories. Things like organizations like Envoy are trying it out and really working to collaborate on other OpenSSF projects looking at improvements. Sonotype has been using this as part of their research in some of their reports. So we've talked a lot about what a scorecard is. We thought it might be just helpful to actually hear from someone who is using scorecards today. So we'll play a quick clip. Christopher Robinson is at Intel, and he was kind enough to just share a few thoughts on where things are at today. Could we get sound for the audio? Sorry, on the AV side?
We get the sound, please. Can you probably pause that?
You know what? We could probably come back to this.
Yeah, we can come back to this.
Well, if we have time at the end, we'll play back.
To evaluate open source software. The scorecard is an excellent way to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and give Christopher Robinson one more chance to say his piece here.
I'm Crobe. I'm the Director of Security Communications at Intel. I'm also a community leader and contributor to the OpenSSF. I'm here today to talk about how my organization uses open source software and the OpenSSF Scorecard. Intel has been a long-time contributor to the upstream open source community with over 20 years of involvement in a multitude of projects. We're also one of the founding members of the OpenSSF. We're extremely excited to see projects like the OpenSSF Scorecard come into being because it not only helps us understand the security details about the open source software that we leverage in many of our products, but also internally. And it also helps us understand the security qualities of our own products. Right now, Intel's making sure that all of our public GitHub repos are reporting out through the Scorecard tool so that we can understand where we can improve, but also so consumers of our software understand the types of things we're doing. I think Scorecard is an amazing project that has a ton of value to help describe the security posture of open source projects up and down throughout the ecosystem. So I can't endorse it strongly enough if someone's considering a way to evaluate open source software. The scorecard is an excellent way to make that happen. Thank you.
All right, and thanks to Crobe for recording that. And thanks, AV, for fixing the sound. I'm going to hand this back over to Naveen to talk a little bit about scorecard actions.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian, for giving all the information prior to this. Scorecard last year launched a GitHub Action Scorecard, just an FYI. Scorecard provides a CLI, a GitHub Action, and an API. We will dig into details into all those things as we go on. Scorecard GitHub Action has been installed in 2,600 installations. We see an uptick of 3K stars in GitHub. We are hoping to keep that growing. That's our intention, to keep helping community adopt this. Last fall, we launched a feature that specifically provides scorecard badges. This is essentially for the project owners to showcase the security scorecards of a given project so that consumers can come and understand what's the score of that project. I'm going to switch over. I'm going to So we're going to cheat, and we're going to show right now how can anybody get a badge. We don't want to fumble and do this, so we decided to record it and show this. So installing the badge is pretty simple. If you go to the scorecards repository here in the demo, you should be able to copy a piece of text. You should be able to get to your project, copy, paste it on your README. And there are only a couple of things that you got to change in that, which is the owner and the repo. If you change both those things, you should be able to get a badge. And Brian was kind enough to help with this recording. Thanks, Brian, for this. That's where you see how that comes up. But one caveat on that per se. To get the badge, the API needs to have the data. So you can get the data the API can have the data if you run the scorecard action. And there's another way which I'll talk about, but for you to get the badge, you need to have the API GitHub action running in your repository. How many of you know about Sigstore? Great. Scorecard loves Sigstore. Scorecard utilizes Sigstore for authentication, signing, storing of hash value, all of those things. So we just want to let know we use Sigstore. Last fall, Scorecard launched an API. Why did we launch the API? Scorecard has been scanning repositories for almost 2 years now, and all of this data is available in BigQuery. We spoke to consumers and we realized people wanted HTTP API because they can integrate with all the things that they can do. So that's the fundamental reason for building the API. The API has GET and POST. It's a standard HTTP API. You should be able to hit the QR code and get to the API. This is the standard. The API is available in api.securityscorecards.dev, and the GET is what the most, like all of us would be using. The POST is used by the GitHub action to store data into that. So just to give perspective, what is the GET and the POST specifically for? We also made sure the API is very predictable. So here in this example, you can see Kubernetes is an example, but you should be able to replace this with any other projects that you're looking for. We also made sure the API does not require any authentication tokens, any of those things. So all of this does not require any of that. We run this API as a public good instance, so you should be able to utilize the API. We are not throttling right now, so please don't DDoS this. So what does the API serve? The API serves about 1.2 million GitHub scans that happens every week. The Scorecard project scans about 1.2 million GitHub repositories. We store the data in the API, and anytime you hit that, you get the latest scan results. That's what the API serves. The API also serves if you use the GitHub action, but if you are not part of one of those 1.2 million GitHub repositories, if it's a new repository, then if you install the action, you should be able to get the API data into the API. Who's using the API? Sorry, how's the API being utilized? This is a little old data. We see about 200K requests, not too much. We launched it late fall last year. That's how the API has been. That's our utilization just to now. who's using our API. We don't know who's using our API. So if you're using the API, please come and talk to us. We would love to know. This is one of the users who asked us to get an issue asking, do we have rate limits? And from understanding about the users from Europe in a university trying to use the API for their purposes. Okay, what can we do with this API? Here what you're seeing is a pie chart of top 1,000 critical projects, specifically looking at code review. Like Brian mentioned, one of the critical things to look for any project's health, probabilities of running into vulnerabilities is code review. We decided how can we use this API to answer the questions for top 1,000 critical projects. How do we come up with the top 1,000 critical projects? There's another OpenSSF project called Criticality Score. It's a phenomenal project. Please go look at that. That specifically measures the criticality of any project, and it uses an algorithm built by Rob Pike. So we use that data and then use Scorecard's API to plot this pie chart. As you can see from the pie chart, most of the projects are doing good. Some of them would require some help. But this is this kind of information that you can take back to your organization, hit the API, use the API to go get answers for your own projects. You can get the source code for that API, for that example. It's hosted on my personal Git repo, but you should be able to get that. It's written in Go, but you should be able to use any modern programming language to go use the API. Let's talk about the usefulness. I'm going to be the contributor.
And I will be a security maintainer for a project.
Brian, I would like to submit a PR with a new dependency.
I mean, thank you for the contribution, but is this actually safe?
Would a scorecard be helpful, Brian?
You know, could be, but I'm not quite sure what that is.
Have you looked at a scorecard, Brian? Repository.
So, actually, now that I have, this is great. In fact, I think I'm going to use this API to start checking all my future dependencies. In fact, I think I'm going to start using it for my CI/CD workflow tool. And it's so nice. It's so easy to use. It starts to make me wonder why everyone's not using it.
So this is the perspective. We just want people to understand you can use this API and things that you want to build. If I only have 30 seconds, you can go to dev.dev, get the answer for any of the repository. If you have 5 minutes, run the scorecards CLI, should be able to give you answers. If you have 15 minutes, install the GitHub action, add a badge to any repository. If you have more than a day, incorporate the API into your workflow. We want to make sure that any of these things should be able to help you get to the place that you want to. Mr. Brian.
Great. Well, I'll say a few words about the OpenSSF itself. It's the organization that supports projects like scorecards. If you are looking for information about open source supply chain security, this is a really good place to start. OpenSSF.org has pretty much links to all of its projects, all of its work. In a nutshell, this is a fairly new organization. It came together just over 2 years ago at this point. It's a sub-foundation within the Linux Foundation. And it's really meant to be a place where any companies or organizations that are heavily reliant or care a lot about open source software can come and have a forum to really discuss what major problems are and how to just make open source safer for everyone that's involved in open source. I invite people, who are interested in this problem, take a look at the OpenSSF. There's already a pretty large membership at different levels. We welcome anyone who is interested, though, in the problem itself. And I'll just put up a way that you can get involved. If you start with our repo, there's links back to it. Our repo also has information about if you're interested specifically in things like the scorecard projects, looking for best practices in open source security. Start here. We do community meetings. If you don't have time to actually be in the meeting, they're all recorded, pushed directly to YouTube afterwards. Everything's meant to be very open. All the pieces of the project are things that we just want as many people to participate in as we can. So thank you all for attending. I think we've got quite a fair amount of time for questions. I think about 15 minutes. I'm told, I think, to use the microphones if you do have questions. All right, we'll start here.
Hi. First of all, thank you for doing this. Can you say a little bit something about the license of using data of the API and all that? What is the formal license of using it?
So that's a great question. I think this has actually come up before, and I think it hasn't been that long. I believe that we don't have our full licensing story worked out specifically for the data. You know, the project itself is under a very open license, but right now the data is basically, as long as you're using it for useful ways, it's open. The spirit of the project is to keep it that way, so I believe we will get that story fully worked out. If you have thoughts specifically on what license would work well for you, I'd love to talk just after about some ideas there.
Yeah, when you did the part where you went to the GitHub repo and you added like a few lines of code to the README, what actually happened when you click save? Did it go and scan your whole source code and make a report? And does that update like every time you resave it or automatically? I'm just wondering what happened there.
That's a great question.
Can I take that?
Sure.
Sure. Very good question. So what happens is when you save that image, it actually goes, every time you load the page, it goes, hits the API to check what are the results that are being stored in the API. It's not going to run the scan then. To use that badge, there are two ways to get the data into the API. Either part of the 1.2 million repositories that we scan, option 1. Option 2, if you're not part of the 1.2 million repositories, you go install the GitHub action. So the GitHub action provides an option. By default, it pushes the data to Scorecard's API server, but if you're running on a private repository and you don't want to push that, you have an option to still turn it off. But to answer your question, those are the only ways. The data has to be in the API server for your badge to get the score. I hope I answered your question. Cool, thanks.
All right. Well, I think, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, you asked me yesterday to ask a lot of questions.
I'm glad you're taking us up on that offer.
Discussion going. I think it's a really exciting talk. I think the effort is very useful and very important because actually even when people are not using open source software, they actually are because of the dependencies, right? So my question is, well, you see in the effort that you're doing here, and that's a good start, in a better way, which places are not well maintained and where the issues are, but what to do when we realize, as we might know already, that there are a few projects that are quite widely used but not so well maintained. How to follow up with the findings of the scorecards.
So I'll offer a few thoughts and
No,
if you
so
want to jump in.
Yeah.
So it's an excellent question when it comes to how do we make these things actionable? Because at the end of the day, you know, just knowing what is an issue does not really help make anything more secure. At the moment, you know, our goal is to provide a little bit of guidance and remediation. If you run the scorecard checks and it shows you what your score is, you can go take a look at why that's the case. There's a way to flip a flag to and see in detail, how we scored it the way that we did, so that you can go off and start to remediate it. If you look at the project page too, it will basically offer up some guidance on exactly what you can do. Let's say that you're failing code review. You could basically go and make sure that you have a setting flipped on so that changes are reviewed before they're actually merged in. I think that we can always do quite a bit better, and there's a lot of opportunity in trying to make things more and more actionable. Over time, I think for any of the checks that we're running, we want to keep pairing them with how do you resolve them, how do you give a project kind of the tools to make sure that they can fix things. I think the more detailed we can get, the more that's going to help. I also think there are outright gaps still in some of the detections. There are different checks that are not in scorecards today. Those we'd like to continue adding to a growing list of scorecard checks to make sure we fill some of those.
So if I can have a really quick follow-up. So what if the issue for a project is actually that the maintainers don't have enough time, or there aren't enough maintainers?
So another great question, because that's quite a larger problem in open source, that open source is very varied when it comes to how projects are managed. You have essentially hobby projects all the way to an organization is basically just open sourcing part of their professionally built project. We've been looking as a project to see how we can really align what is important to the maintainers of those projects to help make sure that if we are saying, this security needs to improve, what's the best way for us to do that? We don't have the complete story within scorecards right now, but I think it's going to be kind of a multi-part solution. One way would be making sure that funds are going to projects, especially major consumers of a certain project, giving people more of an opportunity to work with them and try to either volunteer funds in the form of dollars or in the form of volunteer effort, dedicating some engineering resources just to improve things. So, long story short, I don't think we have a perfect answer right now. It's definitely something that all of us are working to find ways to help keep improving. I'd offer up to anybody in the audience, if you have thoughts about ways that we could particularly help different projects make sure that they have everything they need to make things more secure. I don't think I've ever met a project yet who doesn't say, hey, I hate security, I just don't care at all. It always does come down to, how can we either get time or resources to help.
Yeah, thanks. I do hope to get a discussion started about this. I think it's very important. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. It's a great presentation. Can you hear me?
I think I can. We can repeat.
Okay. I saw that you had dependencies listed as one of the checks. I was wondering, have you or would you use as one of the checks publishing a software bill of materials?
So I think everyone heard that. It's a good question, especially with all of the discussion around software bills of materials, or SBOMs, right now. All of our checks at this point are ones that anyone who comes to the scorecard project and proposes and puts in the logic can basically be added. So to my knowledge, I don't think we've talked about that specific check, but if we have.
There are a couple of issues going on specifically talking about this, but if you're interested, you should be able to come and talk to us in our Slack and our GitHub issues, and there's an active conversation going on specifically on SBOM, so we should be able to help you with that specifically. But it is still not finalized because of all the nuances that are happening with SBOM, so we want to take an approach. We want to wait for things to be a little better before we go down the rabbit hole of taking one approach. We want to be cognizant about that.
Yep, that makes sense. One other question, I saw you also had SAST. What do you do in cases where maybe say SAST, there is testing going on, but the tool doesn't detect that? Is there a way where someone can manually say, we do this even though the tool didn't find it?
Scorecard is trying to be automated, so essentially it's not just for a given project, because we're trying to scale about 1.5 million, 1.2 million repositories. So essentially, if there's a new tool that Scorecard doesn't, you can come and do an issue to us, and we should be able to add that tool. We are a growing project, so that's what we are trying to do. But we don't have a way to right now to exclude anything to give any score, because that becomes subjective. People can play games with that, and that's why we're trying to avoid that per se.
I am going to add one thing on this. You're absolutely right that we don't have anything right now that addresses it. There is, let's say it's a pretty early proposal, but one that's starting to circulate in the scorecards community around adding some annotations to checks, because there will always be the case where a new tool is coming out faster than scorecards either knows about it or implements it. So there's a lot of details to be finalized around what this could look like, but the gist of the proposal is creating a format that you can put in your repository that essentially lets you put some annotations around checks to say, I see what the score is, here's additional information that might change. One of those could be, we actually are using this tool, you just don't have support yet.
Thanks. Sorry, one last question. It's a quick one.
Sure.
Have you or would you consider mapping some of your checks to some frameworks like the NIST software or Secure Software Development Framework or any other frameworks?
Yeah, so I think right now, when scorecards originally started, there wasn't quite the set guidance that we're starting to see emerge right now. I think that over time, there's a lot of ways that we can bring those closer together. I think ideally, we are doing as much automated checking as we can to make sure that different standards are being met. So while I don't think we're quite there now, I do think there's a world where over time we would converge in that direction.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you have a score for binary files. I would think that would be a problem with anything that's an open source GUI. Are you really not intending to, I guess, score GUIs that way? I mean, so all the icons, all the whatever is going, and so once you hit 10, you get a 0, right?
We don't ding you for images or icons or any of that. We ding you only for other kind of binaries like jar files and things like that. We don't ding you. We don't ding you for GIF and those things. Only if you're a jar file or Windows executable, Linux executable. To answer your question.
Right. I'll also add, this is my personal opinion, that we're not perfect right now. I think there are going to be more exceptions still that people might make us aware of. I mean, Gradle is an example where there are certain binaries that are required in a Gradle project that we wanted to exempt out so that you're not going against best practices over here. And I think the community is a pretty friendly one. We're always open to trying to just make sure that we're actually delivering a good picture and not just following the rules directly.
I mean, so some part of that could be you're really aiming at libraries that other folks would include as maybe opposed to end product, right? And so part of the question is also a little bit aimed at that, right? Are you aiming for just things that I would use upstream as a developer to include in my project, or is it also aimed at kind of end users to consume things as well?
Yeah, I think debate over this is still pretty nascent in the project, but I think similar to anything else, if you do have thoughts around it too, we'd love to talk more. If you have a few minutes after.
Yeah. Yep. I think we have time.
Actually, I think we might have all of 30 seconds left. So I just want to thank you all again for coming. Open source security, we assume, is going to keep being a more and more important topic. So thank you for starting here. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to the project. It'll eventually loop back to us. Thank you again.
Thank you.